There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a highway when something has gone wrong in a way that cannot be undone quietly. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of 300 people in stopped cars who have stepped out onto the asphalt and are standing there shading their eyes watching something large and expensive fail in slow motion while the August sun hammers down on everything without mercy or preference. That was the silence on Interstate 94 11 miles east of Milwaukee at 8:14 in the morning on a Tuesday in August of 1998. Carl Merritt heard it before he saw the overturned mixer. He heard it the way a man who has spent 16 years in this business learns to hear things through the scanner, through the dispatcher's voice, through the particular cadence of a state trooper who is trying to sound calm and is not succeeding. He pulled his pickup onto the shoulder 200 yards back behind the line of cones that patrol had already set, and he sat behind the wheel for a moment with the engine running and his hands loose in his lap, looking at the silhouette of the cement mixer against the sky. It was lying on its passenger side. The drum was pointing roughly northeast. The cab was crumpled at the A-pillar, but the windshield was intact, which told him the rollover had been controlled enough that the driver had ridden it down rather than been thrown. He could see hydraulic fluid on the pavement, dark as old blood, in the morning light, spreading in a shape that had no particular meaning except loss. He got out of the truck. Carl Merritt was 48 years old, and he had the hands of a man 20 years older, which is what happens when you spend your 20s on winch cables in Wisconsin winters, and your 30s building something from those winters into something that looked from the outside like a success. He was 6 feet and change, still carrying most of the weight in the right place, with gray at his temples that had arrived early and stayed like a permanent opinion. His face was the kind of face that people in this industry called honest, which meant that whatever he was feeling tended to live there whether he invited it to or not. He wore the same thing he wore every working day: Merit Heavy Recovery Polo Dark Navy Company logo on the left chest in khaki work pants that his wife Diane would have replaced 6 months ago if he had let her. He had not let her. The pants were broken in the way that clothing only gets after years of specific use. Creased in exactly the places a man creases when he spends his days climbing in and out of heavy equipment, kneeling on asphalt, and bracing himself against things that push back. Merit Heavy Recovery had started in 1982 with one truck, a 1971 Ford F600 with a Holmes 440 wrecker body that Carl had bought from a retired operator in Racine for $4,000 in 8 months of favors. He had run that truck alone for 3 years, sleeping 4 hours a night during winter storm seasons, eating drive-through food in parking lots, learning the business not from a manual, but from the undercarriage of every vehicle he pulled out of every ditch on every county road in a 60-mile radius. By 1985, he had 2 trucks. By 1990, he had 7. By the time he bought the Century 1955 Rotator in February of 1998, 6 months before this particular Tuesday morning, he had 19 vehicles, 41 employees, state contracts in 2 counties, and a reputation that people in the heavy recovery business in southeastern Wisconsin referred to with a specific tone that contained both respect and the faint edge of resentment that attaches to anyone who has built something others wanted to build first. The Century 1955 was the reason this morning mattered in a way that most mornings did not. $380,000, financed over 10 years at 9% through a commercial lender in Chicago, whose representative had flown in specifically to close the deal, which told Carl everything he needed to know about what the lender thought of the contract potential. The machine was the most advanced recovery vehicle commercially available in 1998, 55 tons of rated lifting capacity, a hydraulic boom that could extend 40 feet and rotate a full 360 degrees, outrigger pads the size of dining room tables, and a computerized load monitoring system that could tell an operator within 2% exactly how much stress any given configuration was placing on any given component. Diane had sat across from the loan officer and signed her name on the co-guarantee without asking Carl to go over the numbers again, because she had been married to him for 19 years and had learned to read the particular quality of his certainty. The way it was different from ordinary confidence, denser and quieter, like a load-bearing wall rather than a decorative column. She trusted that quality. Carl had spent 6 months being aware of that trust in the way a man is aware of a debt he intends to honor, but cannot stop thinking about. He had told Grady Foss to bring the rotator. Grady was 34, the best operator. Carl had a compact and methodical man from Sheboygan who had come up through the industry the hard way and had the kind of professional precision that expressed itself as a total absence of unnecessary motion. When Grady did something, he did it once correctly and moved to the next thing. He did not waste effort or conversation. He was the kind of man that equipment seemed to work better for, as though machines responded to being handled without drama. Carl had hired him in 1993 after watching him recover a jackknife semi from a flooded ravine outside Fond du Lac in conditions that had turned back two other operators, and in the 5 years since Grady had become the person Carl assigned to anything that needed to be done exactly right. This needed to be done exactly right. The state patrol sergeant, a man named Vickers, whose nameplate Carl had memorized from previous contracts, met him at the edge of the cone line with the expression of a man who had been managing a bad situation for 90 minutes and was prepared to manage it for 90 more, but would prefer not to. Vickers was tall and dry and professional. He gave Carl the summary without being asked. Mixer had been eastbound at approximately 60 miles per hour. When the right front tire failed, driver had overcorrected the rig, had gone onto its side. Crossing both eastbound lanes, driver had walked to the median with a broken collarbone and a cut above his left eye. Ambulance had taken him at 7:42. The drum contained approximately 8 cubic yards of wet concrete. Gross vehicle weight with load was somewhere between 88 and 92,000 pounds, depending on how accurately the load ticket reflected actual fill. Traffic was backed up 9 miles and growing. The concrete had been mixed at 6:30, which meant it had been in the drum for 1 hour and 44 minutes by the time Carl was standing there. Concrete in the drum of a mixer begins to lose workability at approximately 90 minutes in warm weather. In August in Wisconsin, with the sun already high and the ambient temperature climbing toward 86 degrees, the material in that drum was past its optimal window. It was not yet set, not yet irretrievable, but it was moving in that direction with the patience and certainty of a natural process that does not negotiate. Carl did the math without making it visible on his face. He had perhaps 3 hours before the concrete in that drum became a permanent part of the drum, at which point the mixer ceased to be a recovery problem and became a demolition problem, which was a different category of problem entirely, and one that would take 2 days of cutting crew and a bill to the state that would make the contract look thin. He told Vickers 2 hours and walked back to the shoulder. The Century 1955 arrived 40 minutes later. Carl had taken the time to walk the scene. He had looked at the mixer from the front. From the rear, from both sides, had noted the way it was resting on the cab, and the drum collar had observed the ground conditions, had estimated the center of gravity of the combined rig and load. The pavement here was standard highway asphalt, 12 years old, laid over what the county survey maps described as a compacted gravel base over sandy substrate. Standard construction for this corridor. He had done recoveries on this stretch of 94 before. He knew the ground. He knew the ground, and he made a decision about it, and he made that decision quickly because the cameras from Channel 4 were already set up on the far shoulder, and a reporter he recognized from the evening news was standing in front of them doing a piece to camera, and Carl Merritt was 48 years old and had spent 16 years building something. And this was the morning it was going to be seen by everyone in Milwaukee who watched the 6 o'clock news, and the Century 1955 cost $380,000. And it was going to move this mixer in 2 hours, and that was how it was going to go. The sandy substrate was a risk. The outrigger pads, even at their size, would be distributing load across a surface that had some give to it. In ideal conditions on solid ground, the 1955's rated capacity was 55 tons. In conditions with soft substrate, that rating carried a caveat that the machine's technical documentation expressed in careful engineering language that translated plainly to the outriggers may not hold. Carl knew this. He had looked at the ground, had pressed the toe of his boot against the asphalt, had felt the faint give that told him what was under the surface, and he had made a judgment call. The judgment call was that it would probably be fine, and that if he went back to Vickers and said he needed to wait for ground assessment, impossibly ground reinforcement, the cameras would film that conversation, and the story would become something different from what he needed it to be. He told himself this was a reasonable professional judgment based on experience. He had made hundreds of calls like this over 16 years, and they had been right far more often than they had been wrong. He told himself this and believed approximately 70% of it. Grady positioned the 1955 with the efficiency that made him worth what Carl paid him. The machine came off the carrier, the outriggers deployed the pads, made contact with the asphalt, and the boom extended with the hydraulic hum that Carl had come to associate with the machine's particular brand of competence. The Channel 4 camera tracked all of it. Carl stood 10 yards back, arms crossed, watching Grady work, and he felt the thing he had been reaching for since he saw the mixer lying on the highway. This was right. This was what 38 years of working with machines led to. This was the return on everything. Grady ran the slings under the mixer's frame at the two primary lift points, the front axle housing and the rear frame rail behind the drum collar. The rigging was cleaned by the book exactly as the manufacturer's training protocol specified. He connected the main hook, ran his checks, and looked back at Carl. Carl gave him the go. The boom lifted. The cables went taut. The hydraulic pumps built to their working pressure with a whine that Carl could feel in his back teeth. The mixer did not move. Not an inch. Not a fraction of an inch. The cables were straight and hard as iron rods. The boom was at maximum extension. The pumps were at operational pressure, and the mixer lay exactly where it had lain for the past 2 hours, as though it had decided this was where it lived now and was not interested in renegotiating. Grady held the pressure for 30 seconds, which is longer than it sounds when you are standing on a highway shoulder, watching $380,000 strain against 88,000 pounds and not winning. Then something changed in the sound of the machine, a quality that Carl's ear caught before his brain processed it, a note in the hydraulic whine that went up slightly and then changed character, and Grady was already releasing the pressure before Carl had the radio to his mouth. The right rear outrigger pad had punched through the asphalt surface. It had not gone through dramatically or catastrophically. It had gone through the way things go through underload, when the material beneath them is not what the load calculation assumes, slowly, with a kind of deliberate intention. The pad, sinking perhaps 3 inches into the surface, as the substrate compressed and shifted, the boom tilting fractionally to that side, the whole machine settling into a new geometry that was not dangerous, not yet, but was no longer the geometry that the rigging had been set for. Carl looked at the pad, at the broken asphalt around it, at the dark outline of compacted sand visible in the crack. He was aware of the Channel 4 camera. He was aware of Vickers standing 40 yards away, with his arms at his sides in the particular posture of a man who is deciding whether to walk over. He was aware of his own heartbeat, which had moved from its normal position somewhere in his chest to a position that felt slightly higher and more prominent. He told Grady to reposition. They repositioned. They moved the machine 15 feet to the west to a section of pavement that looked more solid, and they reset the outriggers and ran new rigging from a different angle, a lower approach that put more of the load vector in line with the mixer's center of gravity rather than above it. This was a sound adjustment, technically correct, the kind of adaptive thinking that good operators do. Carl walked through it with Grady, talked through the geometry, confirmed the new configuration made sense. The second attempt lasted 90 seconds before the left front outrigger pad began to creep. Not punch through, just creep, the slow lateral migration of a loaded pad across a surface that is not holding position, which in practical terms means the same thing as punching through, but more politely. Grady killed the hydraulics. By 11 in the morning, 2 hours after Grady had made his first lift attempt, Carl had a hydraulic hose failure on the right side of the boom, a cracked outrigger pad on the left rear, a mixer that had not moved measurably from its original position, and a traffic backup that the scanner was now reporting at 14 miles. The concrete in the drum was transitioning from the consistency of heavy oatmeal towards something that had real opinions about its own shape. One of the state patrol units had radioed to ask whether there were other recovery operators who should be contacted. Carl had told Vickers, with a steadiness he was concentrating on maintaining, that he needed 1 more hour. He was standing at the rear of the 1955 with Grady looking at the cracked pad and doing arithmetic about the machine's remaining capacity in its current condition when he heard the sound. It came from the direction of the on-ramp from the south, from somewhere behind the wall of stopped traffic. And it was not a sound that belonged to 1998. It was a sound that belonged to an era before the highway existed, a mechanical clatter and chank that suggested a chain drive rear axle and an engine that had been running continuously since before the Korean War had its first skirmish. It came closer with the patience of something that has no concern about keeping pace with modern expectations, growing gradually from a background note into a presence, and then the home 750 came around the bend of the shoulder, and Carl Merritt saw it for the first time in 3 years and felt something move through his chest that he did not immediately have a name for. The truck was the color of time. It had been painted dark green and cream in 1953, the year Ezra Merritt bought it from its original owner. And those colors had spent 45 years becoming something different, something that was neither green nor cream, but the particular shade that results from decades of sun and weather and road salt operating on paint that was never quite thick enough to begin with. The wooden boom was darker than it should have been, seasoned by a half-century of Wisconsin seasons, but it was solid, visibly solid, the riveted steel fittings still tight. The chain drive rear end produced the sawmill sound that Carl remembered from his childhood, the sound of Sunday afternoons in Ezra's garage, of learning to identify components by their noise before he was old enough to work on them directly. The truck had no doors, no windows in any meaningful sense. Ezra sat in the open cab on a bench seat that had been recovered in green vinyl sometime in the 1970s. Wearing his quill coveralls and a baseball cap that Carl recognized as the kind of thing his uncle had worn for so long, it had become less an article of clothing than an extension of his personality. Ezra Merritt was 74 years old. He had been Carl's uncle for all 48 of Carl's years, his father's younger brother, and before Carl's father died in 1989, the three of them had been the kind of family that people in this industry built around the work itself. Sunday dinners that included oil rags on the table and arguments about transmission ratios that were entirely serious. After Carl's father was gone, the relationship between Carl and Ezra had continued in a modified form, the form that relationships take when the person who anchored them is no longer present, and the two remaining people are trying to figure out what they are to each other without the benefit of that anchor. They had managed it reasonably well until 1995, when Carl had made a decision that Ezra had called him about once on a Tuesday evening, speaking with the quiet precision of a man who has chosen his words carefully and intends to say them only once. Carl had listened, and then he had explained his reasoning, and then the conversation had ended, and they had not spoken since. Ezra shut off the engine and climbed down from the cab with the deliberate care of a man who has learned to be precise about where he puts his weight, whose knees have strong opinions about certain angles and have been expressing those opinions for at least a decade. He was not tall. He had never been tall. Carl's father used to say that Ezra got the brains in the hands, and Carl's father had gotten the height, which was a comfortable family mythology that contained enough truth to sustain itself. Ezra was compact and precise with the forearms of a man who has spent 50 years working with cable and chain, and his face had the quality of aged wood, weathered to something past ordinary old, into something that looked as though it had considered everything it had seen and arrived at conclusions. Carl walked toward him with the awareness of the cameras behind him, and the awareness of Grady watching from the rotator, and the awareness of Vickers beginning to drift in their direction. "Uncle Ezra." The words came out flatter than he intended. "What are you doing here?" Ezra looked at the mixer. He looked at the Century 1955 with its cracked pad and its asymmetric outrigger geometry. He looked at the hydraulic fluid on the pavement. His expression did not change in any dramatic way, but Carl had spent enough of his life reading that face to understand that the absence of visible judgment was itself a form of judgment. "Heard you had some trouble." Ezra's voice had not changed in 3 years. It had the same quality. It had always had the quality of something that does not raise itself to compete with noise, but expects the noise to settle down and listen. "Thought I'd come see. We're handling it." Carl heard himself and made an adjustment. "It's a complicated recovery. Substrate soft. We're working out the right approach." Ezra looked at the pavement around the outrigger pad, at the crushed asphalt, at the visible sand in the crack. He looked at this for perhaps 4 seconds, which is long enough to understand what you are looking at if you have been looking at things like this for 50 years. "How long ago did you know about the substrate?" Carl did not answer immediately, which was itself an answer. "The concrete." Ezra said it the way he said most things, as a statement that contained a question and quieted, the way a seed contains a tree. How long before it sets hard enough that the drum won't turn? We have time. That's not what I asked. Carl looked at the mixer, at the drum angled skyward, at the faint shimmer of heat coming off the pavement around it. 2 hours, maybe a little less. Ezra nodded, not as though this was news, but as though it confirmed something he had already calculated on the drive over. If the drum freezes, you're not moving this mixer anywhere today. You'll be cutting it apart. 2 days minimum, probably 3. The state will eat the cost, and you'll eat the contract. I know what happens if the drum freezes, Ezra. Then you know what the actual deadline is. Ezra looked at him directly with the particular quality of attention that Carl had spent his whole life being unable to be comfortable with, not because it was harsh, but because it was complete. Give me an hour. If I can't move it, I'll take the truck back and you can keep working. There were things Carl could have said. He was aware of all of them, the way a man is aware of the tools in a box, and he went through them quickly and set most of them aside. He could have said that a 40-year-old chain drive wrecker had no business on this recovery. He could have said that this was a state contract with cameras and reputations involved, and the last thing he needed was a museum piece making things more complicated. He could have said that 3 years of silence had established a distance that gave neither of them the standing to make demands of the other. He said 1 hour, if it doesn't work, you go quietly. No scenes. Ezra nodded once. He walked back to the home 750 and began without hurry to open the wooden toolbox mounted behind the cab. Carl walked back to where Grady was standing by the 1955. Grady was watching Ezra with an expression that Carl had learned to interpret over 5 years, a careful professional neutrality that contained somewhere beneath it active curiosity. Who is that? Grady kept his voice level, the way he kept most things. My uncle. Grady watched Ezra lifting equipment from the toolbox. Chains, cable snatch, blocks, wooden chocks, steel stakes. That Holmes, 750? Yeah. I've seen pictures. Never seen one running. That one's been running since 1953. Grady was quiet for a moment. What's he going to do? I don't know. Carl said it honestly, which was the only way he knew how to say things he did not know. Watch. What Carl did not know at that moment, and would not know until much later, was that Ezra had not driven to the scene when the call came over the scanner at 8:30 that morning. He had driven to within 2 miles of the scene, pulled the Holmes 750 to the shoulder of an access road, and sat there for 90 minutes listening to the scanner, watching the situation develop through the lens of what he knew about substrate conditions on this stretch of highway, about the weight distribution of a loaded mixer, and about his nephew. He had waited until he was certain that Carl had done everything Carl knew how to do, and that those things had not been enough. He had waited because he understood something about pride that most people only understand in retrospect, that a man who has helped before he has exhausted himself will never fully understand what the help was for. He had waited, and then he had driven the remaining 2 miles, and now he was here, moving with the unhurried efficiency of a man who has already thought through what he is about to do and has no interest in thinking through it again. Callum Merritt had been in Carl's truck since 7:30 that morning. He was 10 years old, and it was summer, and he had asked to come, and Carl had said yes because on certain kinds of mornings, when something genuinely large and consequential was happening, Carl wanted his son close to it. He wanted Callum to see what the work looked like when it was real work. Not the version of it that Carl described at dinner in terms of contracts in equipment and revenue, but the actual physical reality of it, the weight and the heat in the machinery, and the problem that did not have a clean solution until it did. He had told Callum to stay in the truck, and Callum had stayed until Callum hadn't. Carl became aware of his son standing at his elbow approximately 3 minutes after Ezra began walking the scene. Callum was a quiet child in the way that some children are quiet not from shyness or absence, but from a habit of attention that made him slow to speak because he was taking in more information than he was ready to process into words. He had Carl's coloring and Diane's eyes and Ezra's hands, which Carl had noticed when Callum was about 4 and had not mentioned because he was not sure what it meant and was not sure it meant anything. He stood at Carl's elbow and watched Ezra walk a slow circuit around the overturned mixer, stopping at intervals, crouching once to look at something on the underside of the frame, and the expression on Callum's face was the expression of a child who is watching something he wants to understand and is storing the parts he cannot understand yet in a place where he will find them later. Dad? Callum's voice was low. Did you call Uncle Ezra? No, Callum processed this. Then how did he know? Carl looked at his son. He looked at the earnest, careful quality of the question, which was not actually a simple question. The scanner. He listens to the scanner. Callum nodded slowly in a way that suggested he was accepting this as part of the answer, but not the whole of it. He watched Ezra crouch again near the front axle housing, running a hand along the frame rail, and then stand and walk back to the homes, 7-5. Oh, with the particular quality of purposefulness that Carl recognized had always recognized as the thing that separated a man who was doing from a man who was performing doing. What Carl did not know, because Callum had not told him and would not tell him for 20 years, was what had happened 40 minutes earlier, while Carl was standing with Grady by the damaged outrigger pad and not looking at his truck. Callum had climbed out of the pickup, walked 300 yards along the shoulder to the Clark station that sat at the mouth of the on-ramp, gone to the payphone on the exterior wall, and called Ezra's number from memory. The call had lasted 45 seconds. Callum had said they can't move it, and the concrete is going to set, and my dad doesn't know what to do, and I think you should come. Ezra had said, I know. I'm already close. Go back to the truck. And Callum had gone back to the truck and sat there with the knowledge of what he had done, which was a complicated thing for a 10-year-old to sit with, not because he thought it was wrong, but because he understood in the way that children understand things they cannot yet articulate. That he had made a choice on his father's behalf that his father would not have made for himself, and that this was significant in a way that he did not yet have the vocabulary to name. He stood at Carl's elbow and watched his great-uncle work and did not say anything about the payphone or the 45 seconds or the particular quality of Ezra's voice when he said, I know, which had been the voice of a man who has been waiting for an invitation he was not sure would come. Carl watched as Ezra stake the first ground, anchor into the shoulder soil off the pavement in the dirt that bordered the concrete barrier, and felt something he had not expected to feel, which was that he did not know what Ezra was doing. He had 38 years in this industry. He had managed 88,000-pound recoveries. He had built a company from 1 truck to 19. And he was standing on the shoulder of Interstate 94, watching his 74-year-old uncle pound steel stakes into the dirt shoulder with a hand maul. And he did not know what the plan was. This was not a comfortable thing to know about yourself. Carl Merritt was a man who always knew what the plan was, who always had the next step organized before the current step was complete, and the absence of that knowledge had a texture to it that he was not accustomed to and did not particularly welcome. The Channel 4 camera was still running. The reporter had moved closer. Vickers had drifted to within 20 yards and stopped watching with the professional patience of a man who has seen a great many things fail on this highway and is reserving judgment about this particular thing. Carl crossed his arms. He watched. He did not speak. Ezra drove the third stake and began running cable between them, and as the configuration began to take shape, Carl felt the first faint edge of something that might, if he allowed himself to follow it, become understanding. Ezra was not rigging to lift. He was rigging to roll. The geometry of the cable runs the angles, the placement of the snatch blocks. It was oriented not toward the top of the overturned mixer, but toward its underside, toward the point of contact between the drum collar and the pavement in a configuration designed not to pick the machine up, but to rotate it around its own longitudinal axis using the machine's mass and the mechanical advantage of the pulley system to accomplish what lifting force had failed to accomplish. Don't fight the weight, Carl heard, though Ezra had not spoken. Use it. He could not have said with certainty whether this was a memory or a voice. Ezra had said something like it once years ago in the garage on a Sunday afternoon when Carl was perhaps 16, and they were working on a hydraulic line that had been giving trouble, and Ezra had watched Carl force a connection that needed coaxing rather than forcing, and had said it then low and without drama, don't fight the material. Work with what it wants to do. Carl had been 16, and he had heard it as advice about a hydraulic fitting and had not understood that it was advice about everything. He was 48 now. He looked at the rigging Ezra was building, at the elegant mechanical logic of it, at the way it was designed to cooperate with the mixer's geometry rather than oppose it, and he felt the thing he had been avoiding feeling since 8:14 that morning begin to arrive through a side door he had not adequately secured. It was not panic. Carl Merritt did not panic. It was something quieter and more permanent, the recognition that the $380,000 had been the wrong answer to the right question, and that he had known the question was right and had let the size of the answer convince him it must be correct. He looked at his son standing at his elbow, with his eyes on Ezra's hands, watching the cable run through the snatch blocks with an expression of complete concentration. Carl said nothing. He watched. He waited. He held the weight of what was coming because he understood now with the clarity that sometimes arrives too late to be comfortable, but not too late to matter, that something was about to happen on this highway that would be true whether or not he was ready for it, and the only variable remaining was whether he would be present for it in a way that counted. The mixer lay on the pavement, the concrete hardened by slow degrees. The August sun reached its maximum angle and began its descent. And Carl Merritt stood on the shoulder of Interstate 94 with his arms crossed and his son at his elbow and his $380,000 machine behind him and his uncle's hands moving through familiar motions in front of him, and he waited to find out what he was about to learn. Ezra Merritt did not look at anyone when he worked. This was something Carl had noticed as a young man and was noticing again now with the particular sharpness of observation that arrives when you are watching something you cannot participate in and cannot look away from. Ezra's attention, once committed to a problem, had a quality of totality that excluded the peripheral world not out of rudeness, but out of the same necessity that makes a surgeon stop hearing the music in the operating room. The cameras did not exist. The 14 miles of stopped traffic did not exist. Vickers and his clipboard did not exist. There was the mixer and the ground and the cable and the physics, and Ezra moved among these things with the unhurried focus of a man who has learned that urgency and haste are not the same condition, and that confusing them is how people get hurt. He spent the first 20 minutes walking, just walking and looking and occasionally crouching and once lying flat on the pavement on his side to see the angle of the frame rail against the road surface, which put his cheek approximately 6 inches from hot asphalt, in which he accomplished with the matter-of-fact physicality of a man who stopped being precious about his clothing sometime around 1961. Grady watched this from beside the Century 1955 with the expression of a man recalibrating. Carl watched from 10 feet further back with no expression at all, which cost him more than he would have admitted. 3 of Carl's crew had been standing near the 1955 since the second attempt failed. They were good men, experienced, and they had the particular quality of professional stillness that workers adopt when a situation has exceeded the plan and the boss is present and no one is sure what the next directive will be. They watched Ezra walk his slow circuits around the mixer with the same careful neutrality they might have applied to watching a weather system develop. One of them, a young operator named Briggs, who had been with the company 8 months, leaned toward the man beside him and said something low. The other man shook his head once. They went back to watching. Grady broke from the group and walked toward Ezra as Ezra completed his third circuit and came back toward the home 750. It was not something Carl had directed him to do. Grady operated on his own professional judgment in the way that genuinely skilled people do, and his professional judgment told him that whatever this old man was about to do was worth understanding, and that understanding it meant asking rather than observing from a distance. Ezra looked at him the way he looked at most things, with an assessment that was not unfriendly, but was not automatically warm either, the look of a man who decides what a person is worth based on evidence rather than manner. Grady met the look without performance, which was the right response because Ezra had no patience for performance and considerable patience for straightforwardness. Grady's voice was even. "Can I give you a hand with the stakes?" Ezra studied him for a moment. "You run the rotator." "Yes, sir." "Why did you stop the second attempt?" Grady did not hesitate. Left front pad was migrating. Another 40 seconds and the boom geometry would have been outside the safe envelope. Ezra nodded, which was his version of a significant acknowledgement. "You saved the machine." He looked at the 1955 with its cracked pad and the dark stain of hydraulic fluid. "What's your read on why the outriggers failed?" Grady was quiet for 2 seconds, the kind of pause that precedes an honest answer rather than a diplomatic one. "We were trying to lift at a point above the center of mass. The load vector was wrong for the ground conditions. We needed more horizontal force, not more vertical. Ezra looked at him with an attention that sharpened slightly. You knew this before the second attempt. The pause this time was 3 seconds. I had concerns. Did you tell him? Grady did not look toward Carl. He did not need to. I told him the substrate was soft. He said we'd adjust the pad positions. Ezra turned back to his toolbox and lifted out a coil of cable. Come help with the stakes. Then without looking up from the cable, you know why that machine of yours failed? Not the mechanical reason, the real one. Grady waited. Ezra's hands moved through the cable coil with the automatic expertise of 50 years. Your boss needed it to work in a specific way in front of specific people on a specific timeline. When a man needs a tool to work badly enough, he stops asking whether it's the right tool and starts asking how hard he can push it. That's not an equipment problem. He set the cable down and looked at Grady directly. You already knew it was the wrong approach. That's worse because it means the knowledge was there and it didn't change anything. Grady absorbed this without visible reaction, which was his way. But something shifted in the set of his shoulders, something that was not quite shame and not quite resolution, but occupied the territory between them. And he picked up the near end of the cable and began walking it toward the first ground stake. Carl had not heard this exchange. He was standing 30 feet away, and the ambient sound of the highway and the idling equipment absorbed the words before they reached him. But he watched Grady begin helping Ezra without having been directed to do so, watched the two men work together with the immediate and wordless efficiency of people who share a technical language, and felt something tighten in his chest that he located initially as irritation, and then upon examination understood was something closer to exclusion. He had built this company. He had hired Grady. He had made every decision that had brought every piece of equipment and every person to this stretch of highway on this particular morning. And now his best operator was running cable with a 74-year-old man, and Carl was standing 10 feet back, watching it happen. He walked forward, not toward Ezra, but toward the mixer circling to the far side, putting the machine between himself and the cameras. He crouched where Ezra had crouched earlier and looked at the angle of the frame against the pavement, and he tried to see what Ezra had seen. The frame rail was resting on the road surface at a point approximately 18 inches aft of the front axle. The drum collar was in contact with the pavement at an angle that placed the drum's center roughly 4 feet above the road surface. The mixer's mass was distributed, he estimated, with roughly 60% of the load resting on the cab structure and frame, and 40% cantilevered through the drum assembly. Lifting from the top, which is what the rotator had attempted, meant working against that entire load in a vertical direction from a point above the center of mass, which in soft substrate conditions created a moment arm that the outriggers could not resist. Rolling, on the other hand, meant applying force at the base of the mass and working with the rotational potential that the geometry itself suggested. The mixer was already partway through a rotation. It wanted to complete the rotation. The question was not whether physics would cooperate, but whether you were smart enough to ask it the right question. Carl stood up slowly. He was aware of having arrived at this understanding by himself on this side of the mixer, away from the cameras and away from Ezra, and he was aware that it did not change what had already happened, which was that Ezra had already arrived at it and was already acting on it. The knowledge felt like something he had found in his own pocket after looking for it in every other place. He came back around the mixer. Ezra and Grady had the snatch block configuration established at the first ground stake and were running the secondary cable back toward the mixer's underframe. Carl watched the geometry of it resolve as the rigging took shape, the mechanical advantage building through the pulley arrangement, the way compound interest builds each block, multiplying the available force by a factor that the Home 750's single winch drum, producing its antique and unimpressive torque, could leverage into something that the math said would work. Don't lift it, roll it. Less force, right direction, right place. The problem Carl had been solving was not the problem on the pavement. He stood back and let them work. The drum needed to be locked. This was something Ezra addressed next, running a separate chain arrangement from the drum itself to ground anchors on the opposite side of the mixer. Not to hold the mixer down, but to prevent the drum from rotating independently of the chassis during the recovery. A loose drum in a rollover recovery is a shifting load. and a shifting load is the variable that turns a controlled operation into an uncontrolled one. With the drum locked, the entire mixer became a single rigid mass, predictable in its behavior. Its center of gravity fixed, its response to applied force calculable rather than approximate. Ezra wrapped the chains with the precision of a man who has done this exact thing before, who knows which points on the drum collar accept chain without slipping, and which ones look like they will hold and then don't. Carl found himself thinking about the first time he had seen Ezra chain a drum. He had been 12 years old, and it had been a smaller mixer on a county road outside Waukesha, a job that most operators would have considered routine, and that Ezra had treated with the same methodical attention he was bringing to this one. Carl had watched from the shoulder of that county road the way Callum was watching from the shoulder of this interstate, storing information in a place he would find later. And afterward, Ezra had explained each decision in the way he explained most things, quietly and completely, without condescension or theater, as though the information simply belonged to Carl and Ezra was returning it to him. Carl had spent 20 years thinking he had carried those lessons forward. Standing here watching Ezra work, he was performing an audit of that assumption and finding the results incomplete. Ezra checked every connection twice. This was not a tick or a habit or a performance of diligence. It was the physical manifestation of a principle that Carl had heard him articulate once in the garage to a young man who had been impatient with a double check. The second look is not for the connection. It's for the thing you missed the first time because you were thinking about the next step. Carl was thinking about the next step approximately 30% of every working moment. He recognized this about himself the way you recognize a pattern in your own handwriting as something that is yours and has always been yours, and that you notice most clearly when someone else holds up the paper. Ezra climbed into the home 7-5. Oh, the cab open on both sides gave him no enclosure, no windshield, no frame of reference other than the steering wheel and the instrumentation, which in a 1947 truck meant an oil pressure gauge, a temperature gauge, and an ammeter, none of which told you anything useful beyond the machine's most basic vital signs. He engaged the power takeoff which connected the truck's transmission to the winch drum through a mechanical arrangement that had no electronic mediation, no load monitoring, no computer telling you when you were approaching a limit. It was metal driving metal through a gearing system that multiplied force by a factor of 12, and the operator's only feedback was what he could hear and what he could feel through the controls, which meant the operator had to know what he was listening for and what the feeling of approaching a limit felt like before the limit arrived. Ezra knew both of these things the way he knew his own breathing. The winch engaged with a sound that was nothing like the rotator's hydraulic whine. It was mechanical in the older and more literal sense, gears meshing and chain links engaging, and a drum turning that had been turning on this same truck for 45 years. And the sound had a weight to it, a density that Carl associated with the earliest memories he had of this work. The cable went taut. The snatch blocks creaked against their load. The ground stakes held the steel biting into the shoulder soil at the angle Ezra had calculated to carry the load vector without migrating. For 30 seconds, nothing visible happened. This was the hardest 30 seconds. Carl had watched enough recoveries to understand that the interval between full load and initial movement is not a sign that the system is failing, but a period during which the mechanical advantage is distributing itself through the rigging, finding the path of least resistance, through the geometry loading each component to its working position. It was physics doing its work at the cellular level before the result became visible. But 30 seconds is a long time when you are standing on a highway with cameras running and 14 miles of stopped traffic behind you and a drum full of hardening concrete in front of you. And Carl stood through it with his arms at his sides and his hands open, which was how he stood when he was making himself be still. The mixer moved. It did not move dramatically. It moved the way a sleeping man shifts his weight incrementally and, without announcement, a rotation of perhaps 2 inches along its longitudinal axis that would have been invisible from more than 20 feet away. But Carl was inside 20 feet, and he saw it, and beside him, Grady made a sound that was not quite a word, but communicated a complete thought. The Holmes 750 held its load. The engine note did not change. Ezra gave the winch nothing more than the steady engagement he had started with, no surging, no additional power, because the mechanical advantage was already doing the multiplication, and adding more input would not accelerate. The result would only add stress to the chain at the point where stress was already concentrated. He held steady and let the physics work, and the mixer continued its slow rotation 3 inches 6 a foot. Carl's crew had moved closer without being directed to. They stood in a rough arc behind Carl, watching the mixer rotate with the focused attention of people who have stopped pretending they know how this is going to end and are simply watching to find out. The young operator named Briggs had his arms crossed. One of the other men had taken his hat off and was holding it at his side. Vickers had given up the pretense of managing distance and was standing 15 feet from Carl, angling toward the mixer with his full professional attention. 2 feet, 3. The drum chains held. The mass moved as a single unit exactly as Ezra had arranged for it to move. Then the Home 750 stopped. Not a gradual reduction. A stop the engine note dropping from its working register to something rougher and lower the winch, disengaging the cable going slack. The mixer halted in its rotation at the 4-foot mark, precisely at the most precarious point in the arc, the balance point where the mass was neither securely on its side nor committed to upright, where any shift of the load or any loss of the mechanical advantage would result not in progress, but in the mixer settling back to the pavement in the same position it had occupied all morning. The sound from the Home's 750's engine was the sound of an engine that was not going to restart on its own. Carl's chest went hollow, not because the situation was hopeless, he had worked through worse, but because of what it meant for the narrative that was being filmed 30 yards away, and because of what it meant for Ezra, who had come here and built something elegant and precise and was now sitting in an open cab on a stopped truck, watching it fall apart at the worst possible moment. Carl took 3 steps toward the Home 750 before he processed what was happening at his left side. Callum was running, not running toward Carl, not running away from the scene, running toward the Home's 750. Along the shoulder with the particular focused acceleration of a child who knows exactly where he is going and has no interest in the distance between here and there. Carl called his name. Callum did not stop. He reached the Home's 750 and went to the front of the truck to the bumper, and Carl watched him reach down and locate something mounted to the lower frame that Carl had not looked at in years and had not thought about in longer than that. The hand crank. On vehicles manufactured before approximately 1950, when electric starters were reliable enough to be universal, many trucks retained a hand crank as a backup starting mechanism, a steel bar that engaged a socket on the front of the crankshaft and allowed the engine to be started by physical rotation when the electrical system failed. The Home 750 had been built in 1947. It had a hand crank. It had always had a hand crank. And Callum Merritt, who was 10 years old on a Tuesday in August, knew where it was and how it worked because Ezra had shown him on one afternoon 2 years earlier when Diane had dropped Callum at the garage on Lincoln Avenue for 3 hours while she drove to Appleton for a work obligation, an afternoon that Carl had known about abstractly without knowing its content. Callum looked up at Ezra in the open cab. His voice carried clearly in the moment of mechanical silence. "Is the switch on?" Ezra looked down at his nephew's son with an expression that Carl, approaching from behind, could not see, but would spend a long time afterward trying to imagine. "Switch is on. Give it 2 full rotations before you engage." Callum positioned himself, feet planted, hands on the crank. 2 full rotations, which requires a specific body mechanics and is not intuitive without instruction, the weight forward the arms, driving through the full arc, rather than pulling the grip, releasing at the top to avoid wrist injury if the engine kicks back. Callum's form was not perfect, but it was recognizable. He drove the first rotation. He drove the second. On the third engagement, the engine caught. The sound it made coming back was the sound of something that had always been running and had simply paused to make a point. Ezra engaged the winch without ceremony. The cable snapped taut. The snatch blocks loaded. The mixer resumed its rotation from the 4-foot mark, which it had held without settling the weight balance at the pivot point, exactly as the geometry had arranged. Carl stood at the Home 750's right front corner and watched his 10-year-old son step back from the crank with his hands at his sides and his eyes on the mixer, and he felt a sensation in his sternum that had nothing to do with the recovery and everything to do with an afternoon in a garage on Lincoln Avenue that he had not been present for. 5 feet, 6, 7. The mixer passed its balance point at approximately the 8-foot mark. Carl knew the moment it happened because the cable which had been bearing the full load of the rotation against gravity went suddenly lighter, the tension dropping as the mixer's center of mass crossed the vertical axis above its wheels, and gravity, which had been the opposition, became the engine. The rotation accelerated in the final arc, not dramatically, not out of control, but with the assurance of physics completing a statement it had been building toward for 40 minutes. The mixer came upright with a sound that started as a groan of metal finding its geometry and ended as a concussion of chassis settling onto suspension that had not borne load for 3.5 hours. The drum was vertical. The wheels were on the pavement. The cab was crumpled, but the frame was straight. The concrete in the drum, now set to the consistency of something between determination and permanence, would never turn again. But that was the driver's insurance company's problem, not the highway's. The silence afterward lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Then Carl's crew started making noise, and Vickers started making noise, and the state troopers who had been managing the cone line 30 yards away started making noise, and somewhere behind all of it, the Channel 4 camera was recording a story that was going to be on the 6 o'clock news in a way that was not the story Carl had planned for this morning, but was in its own way a story about exactly what Carl had thought this morning was going to be about, which was what this kind of work looks like when someone really knows how to do it. Grady walked to the home 750 and stood at the driver's side. Ezra was disengaging the winch, releasing the cable tension with the same unhurried precision he had applied to building it. Grady looked up at him in the open cab. "I've been running heavy recovery for 11 years. I've never seen that rigging configuration." Ezra climbed down his knees, taking their time with the distance from the running board to the pavement. "It's not a configuration. It's an argument." He moved toward the cable to begin coiling. "You tell the load what's going to happen, and you build the case for it with geometry. If the argument is right, the load agrees." Grady absorbed this and stored it in the place where useful things go. The Channel 4 reporter was moving toward Ezra with the camera tracking behind her. Carl watched her approach and watched Ezra look up from the cable coiling and assess her with the same 2-second evaluation he applied to everything. She had the bright, forward energy of a person who believes they are about to get the central interview, the main voice, the figure the story is organized around. Ezra stopped her at 5 feet. His voice was even and unhurried. "You need to talk to the man running this recovery." He gestured toward Carl with emotion that was not grand, but was unambiguous. "Carl Merritt, this is his operation. His equipment, his crew, his contract." Then before she could redirect, "He called me in for a consult. That's how good operators work. They know what they know and they know what they don't, and when the problem asks for something outside what they have got, they make the call." He picked up the cable coil. He made the right call. Carl stood very still when he heard this, not because the words surprised him in their content, but because of the specific thing they were doing in public, which was building a structure around him at the moment when the structure he had built himself was most visibly damaged. Ezra was not saying something he necessarily believed to be entirely true. He was saying something that was true in the way that matters most, which is the way that protects the thing that needs protecting, so that the person inside it can find their way out on their own terms. Carl understood this in the moment. He also understood that understanding it made it harder to carry, not easier. The reporter pivoted. Carl stepped forward and answered her questions with the steadiness he had cultivated over 20 years of being the responsible party in the situations that did not always cooperate with his plans. He talked about the substrate conditions, about the decision to bring in additional expertise, about the recovery methodology. He did not say the rotator had failed. He did not say he had misjudged the ground conditions. He said what he said, and it was not false, and it was not the whole truth, and this was a balance he had struck many times in his professional life, and would strike many more, and this particular version of it sat less comfortably than most. Callum was standing at the front of the home 750 when Carl finished the interview and walked back. The boy had both hands on the bumper and was looking at the truck with an expression that Carl recognized as the expression of someone learning the shape of something they want to understand completely. Carl stood beside him and they looked at the truck together, the olive and bone paint, the riveted boom, the winch drum with its cable partially coiled, the open cab with the bench seat and the hand crank bracket on the lower frame. Carl's voice came out quieter than he intended. Where did Uncle Ezra teach you to use that? Callum kept his eyes on the truck. At the garage, when Mom drove to Appleton. 2 years ago. Yeah. Carl looked at the hand crank bracket. He teach you anything else? Callum was quiet for a moment, the quiet of a child deciding how much of what he knows to offer at one time. He taught me why you don't lift when you can roll, and why you always look at the ground before you look at the load. A pause. He said you used to know that. Carl said nothing. The weight of the sentence settled into him the way weight settles into ground, that has more give than the surface suggests, not crashing through but pressing down, finding the depth. Ezra was coiling the last of the cable by the home's 750s toolbox. Carl walked toward him with no plan for what he was going to say, which was unusual, and arrived at his uncle's side and stood there for a moment while Ezra finished the coil and set it in the box with the careful placement of a man who intends to find it in the same position next time. That was a good piece of work. Carl heard the inadequacy of it as it left him. Ezra latched the toolbox. He did not look up immediately. When he did, his expression had the quality it always had, which was the quality of a man who has decided to be honest, because the alternative is a waste of the time he has left. It was basic work, basic physics, the kind of work you used to do before you had a machine that cost more than most people's houses. Carl let that sit. The substrate, I knew it was soft. I know you knew. I made a judgment call. Ezra looked at him directly. You made a different kind of call. There's a name for it, but you already know what it is. Carl did know. He had known it since the first outrigger pad sank into the asphalt, since the hydraulic hose blew, since Vickers had started drifting closer with his clipboard and his patience. He had known it in the way you know things you are not ready to say out loud, which is the most expensive kind of knowing. The concrete. Carl looked at the mixer, now upright, its drum frozen in a permanent set. I had about 40 minutes left when you got it up. Closer to 30. Ezra said it without emphasis. I didn't come here to embarrass you. I know that. I came because the job needed doing, and you were out of options, and there wasn't anyone else who knew the right question to ask. Ezra closed the toolbox latch. The question isn't how much force do I have. The question is, what direction does the problem want to move? You ask the second question, and the first one gets a lot easier to answer. Carl was quiet for what might have been 30 seconds, or might have been longer. And in that silence, he heard the highway beginning to move behind them, the slow restart of traffic that had been stationary for 4 hours, the sound of an ordinary Tuesday reassembling itself from the wreckage of the morning. He heard Callum's voice somewhere behind him, talking to Grady, the high register of a 10-year-old asking a question and getting an answer. He heard the Holmes 750's engine cooling the particular ticking sequence of a cast iron block releasing heat in an order it had established for itself over 50 years. Come work with me. The words came out before Carl had decided to say them, which was how the best decisions he had ever made had arrived fully formed from somewhere below the planning function. Consulting, 2 days a week, whatever schedule works. Teaching the crew what you know, the old methods, the thinking before the machinery. Ezra looked at him with the assessment that Carl had been reading since he was old enough to read faces, the one that separated what was being offered from why it was being offered and whether the two were aligned. 3 years ago, you told me the methods I was describing were a liability, that the industry had moved past them. I was wrong. You fired 4 men who thought about this work the way I do. Carl held the look. I was wrong about that too. Ezra said nothing. He turned back to the Holmes 750 and checked the toolbox latch a second time, which Carl recognized as something Ezra did when he was thinking, using the hands to give the mind a moment to work without interference. The Channel 4 camera had moved on. Vickers was on his radio coordinating the lane reopening. Grady was directing the Century 1955 back onto its carrier with the careful attention of a man managing a machine that needs more care than it did this morning. Ezra turned back. I'll think about it. Carl nodded. He understood that this was not a deflection. Ezra had said, I'll think about it, perhaps 4 times in Carl's memory, and each time he had thought about it and come back with an answer, and the answer had always been worth the wait. It was the response of a man who took his own commitments seriously enough to examine them before he made them. Ezra climbed back into the Holmes 750 with his knees taking their time, The engine started on the first turn of the key, which it almost always did once warm, and it settled into its particular idle, the slightly uneven note of an engine whose tolerances had opened over decades into something that was no longer tight, but was magnificently broken in. He backed the truck along the shoulder, working the manual steering with the physicality it required, navigated around the cone line, and began moving south on the shoulder toward the on-ramp. Carl watched him go. Callum came to stand beside his father, and they both watched the home 7.5 diminish along the shoulder, the olive and bone paint catching the afternoon light, the wooden boom swaying with the motion of the truck, the chain drive rear end producing its sawmill sound until the truck curved around the on-ramp and was gone. Callum's voice was quiet. Is he going to come back? Carl put his hand on his son's shoulder, which was something he did less often than he meant to. Yeah, he is. He said it with the certainty of a man who has just spent 4 hours learning the difference between what he knows and what he thinks he knows, and who has arrived somewhat battered at the understanding that the difference matters more than he had been willing to admit. The mixer stood upright on the highway in the afternoon light. The rotator rode its carrier toward the yard with its cracked pad and its blown hose. The home 750 was somewhere on the on-ramp heading back to Lincoln Avenue. And Carl Merritt stood on the shoulder of Interstate 94 with his hand on his son's shoulder and thought about a question Ezra had never quite asked and he had never quite answered, which was, what direction does the problem want to move, and understood for the first time that the problem he had been solving was not the one on the pavement. The news ran that evening on every local affiliate that had a camera on the highway, and then it ran again at 10, and then it was on the radio the next morning, and by Wednesday afternoon it had been picked up by the AP wire and was appearing in newspapers in cities that had no particular reason to care about an overturned cement mixer on Interstate 94 outside Milwaukee, except that the story had the quality that certain stories have the quality of being about something larger than its facts. The footage was clear and well-framed because the Channel 4 operator had good instincts and had positioned himself at the angle that made the home 750 and the Century 1955 visible in the same shot. And what that shot communicated before anyone explained a word of context was the entire argument. Here is the largest and most modern thing, and here is the oldest and smallest thing, and watch which one moves the load. By Thursday, it was on CNN. By Friday, Carl's office phone had received 61 calls, of which approximately half were from people who wanted to know if the old man with the old truck did contract work, and approximately the other half were from people Carl had done business with, who were calling with a tone in their voice that landed somewhere between sympathy and the particular pleasure that people sometimes take in witnessing the humbling of someone they have respected and perhaps slightly resented. Carl took all 61 calls. He returned the ones he had not answered. He was professional and measured, and he said the same thing to everyone who asked about Ezra. He is a consultant to Merit Heavy Recovery, and he is not taking independent contracts. He said this before Ezra had agreed to it, which was the kind of forward commitment Carl had always been willing to make when he was certain enough about the direction of travel. He was certain about this one. Diane watched him take the calls from the kitchen doorway on Thursday evening, leaning against the frame with her arms crossed and the expression she wore when she was deciding whether to say something and settling on waiting. She had seen the footage. Callum had described the day to her in the careful sequential way he described things, starting at 7:30, when he had gotten into Carl's truck, and ending with the hand crank, and what Ezra had said about the ground before the load, and Diane had listened to all of it, and then had gone very quiet in a way that was not worried and was not angry, but was thoughtful in a manner that sometimes preceded her saying something Carl needed to hear and was not ready for. She waited until he was off the phone, and then she said, "When did you last talk to him before yesterday?" Carl set the phone on the counter. 3 years. 3 years. She said it without judgment, which was more effective than judgment would have been. And he came anyway. He came because Callum called him. Diane absorbed this. Callum called him because he knew Ezra would come. A 10-year-old knew that. She uncrossed her arms. Did you know that? Carl looked at his wife of 19 years. She was not asking whether he had known about the phone call. She was asking whether he had known in the way that runs beneath knowledge and does not require information to function, that Ezra would still come. That 3 years of silence had not changed the underlying structure. that what he had walked away from had not walked away from him. "I think I did," Carl said, which was the most honest answer available. "I think I was counting on it without admitting I was counting on it." Diane nodded once, the nod of a woman who has been married long enough to know the difference between a man confessing and a man arriving. She did not say anything else about it. She went back to the kitchen, and Carl stood in the hallway holding the phone that had rung 61 times and thought about what it meant to count on a thing you had not tended. He drove to Lincoln Avenue that night. Not the next day, not the weekend. That night after dinner, after Callum was in bed, and Diane had kissed him at the door with a particular quality of send-off that communicates both permission and expectation. He drove to the rented bay where the Holmes 750 lived, the bay that Ezra paid month to month from a retirement that was comfortable but not extravagant, and he found Ezra exactly where he had expected to find him under the Holmes. 750's front axle with a light on a cord and a socket wrench, because Ezra had a principle about machinery that Carl had absorbed without realizing it, which was that you always service the equipment the same day you work it hard before the fatigue sets in and the small things become larger things. Carl crouched beside the front axle. He did not announce himself because Ezra had heard the truck pull up. He waited. Ezra finished the fitting he was working on and slid out from under the axle with the deliberate sequence of a man managing his angles, and he sat up and looked at Carl with an expression that was not surprised and was not particularly guarded. Carl said, "I want to talk about Pete Garza." The name landed in the silence of the garage with the weight of something that had been waiting to be said for 3 years. Pete Garza had been the senior mechanic at Merit Heavy Recovery for 11 years before Carl let him go in the winter of 1995, part of a reduction that had also included 3 other long-tenured employees whose combined age was 241 years and whose combined salary Carl had determined was not proportionate to the productivity metrics he had begun applying to every line item in the operation. Pete had been 61 years old. He had a wife named Lorraine who had been managing a kidney condition for 4 years, and Carl had known this and had made the calculation anyway and had written the severance check himself because he believed that doing difficult things personally was more honest than delegating them, which was a principle he held genuinely and which had not, in Pete's case, made the difficult thing less difficult or less wrong. Ezra looked at him steadily. "What do you want to say about Pete? I want to know what happened to him." Ezra was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of a man deciding whether to speak, but the quiet of a man deciding how. He found work, loading dock in Kenosha, physical, wrong kind of physical for a man who'd spent 30 years on precision mechanical work, but he kept it for about 8 months. A pause. Lorraine's condition got worse in the spring of '96. The insurance through the loading dock wasn't what he'd had with you. He burned through the savings covering the gap. Another pause, this one longer. Pete had a stroke in November of '96. Stress was a factor. His doctor said that in the report, and the family mentioned it when I went to the service. Carl sat with this, not the way you sit with information you are processing, but the way you sit with something you already knew the shape of and are now seeing the details of for the first time, and the details are exactly what you feared they would be, and not a degree worse, which is somehow not a comfort. "You didn't tell me." "No." "Why?" Ezra looked at the socket wrench in his hand and then set it on the concrete beside him with the care of a man setting down something heavier than it appears. "Because you had made your decision and Pete was gone, and telling you wasn't going to change either of those facts. And because I was angry enough that if I had called you, I would have said it the wrong way, and you would have defended yourself, and we would have ended up further apart than we already were." He looked at Carl directly. "I waited until you were ready to ask." Carl understood this. He understood it the way he had understood the rigging configuration when he had walked around to the far side of the mixer and looked at it from the right angle with the recognition of something that was true, regardless of whether he was ready for it. Ezra had not withheld Pete's story as punishment or leverage. He had withheld it as the last available protection against the conversation going the wrong direction before Carl had enough humility to have it go right. "How long did you wait?" 3 years. Ezra said it without inflection, which was the most precise way to say it. "You got there faster than I thought you might." Carl sat on the garage floor beside his uncle's truck and looked at nothing specific for what might have been 60 seconds. The garage smelled of oil and metal and the particular dusty warmth of a space that has been used carefully for a long time. The home 750 occupied most of the bay with the presence of something that understood its own dimensions exactly. Outside on Lincoln Avenue, a car went past with its windows down, music briefly audible, and then gone. He said, "I'm going to find out if the family needs anything." He said it as a statement of what he was going to do, not as a question about whether it was appropriate or a declaration seeking approval. He said it the way he said things when they were already decided. Ezra nodded once. Lorraine is in assisted living in Oak Creek. Pete Jr. is in Racine. He's got 3 kids. He said this without commentary because the information was what Carl needed and commentary was not. They talked for 2 hours. Not about Pete after the first part, but about the work, about the industry, about what Ezra knew that Carl's operators didn't, and how to transfer that knowledge without it seeming like criticism of what they already had. Carl asked questions he had not asked in 20 years, because he had believed he no longer needed to ask them, and Ezra answered without making him pay for the gap between asking and not asking. By 10:30, they had the outline of what consulting would look like, and by 11, they had shaken hands on it, which was the form of agreement they both trusted more than paper. Carl drove home through the empty streets of Milwaukee with the window down and the night air coming in warm and the radio off. He was thinking about a photograph. He had seen it in Ezra's toolbox tucked against the interior wall when he had been reaching past it for a snatch block earlier in the evening, and he had not asked about it because the evening had had enough weight without adding more. But he was thinking about it now. He had seen it clearly enough in the second his hand had been near it, a boy of perhaps 12 standing beside the home's 750, which had been newer then, and its paint brighter with a particular posture of a child who has just been allowed to do something he has wanted to do for a long time, and is still processing the fact that he was allowed. Carl recognized the posture before he recognized the face, which was his own face 36 years younger, and the recognition had moved through him so quickly that he had not tracked it consciously until now. Driving home when it surfaced with the full weight of what it was, which was evidence that Ezra had kept that photograph in his toolbox for 36 years, had moved it from toolbox to toolbox as the equipment changed, and had kept it there not as a sentiment, but as a fact about what mattered to him. He did not go back to ask about it that night. Some things needed to be allowed to sit at their own weight before you touch them directly. But he would go back and he would ask, and what Ezra would tell him about that afternoon and what he had written on the back of the photograph would do something to Carl that no mechanical failure and no public humbling and no honest conversation about Pete Garza had quite done, which was to locate the precise place in him where he had turned away from something he had loved before the industry became a business, and remind him that the place was still there and still operational. 3 weeks after the recovery on I-94, Ezra Merritt began consulting for Merritt Heavy Recovery 2 days a week. He came on Tuesdays and Thursdays, arriving at the yard at 7, driving his own truck, because he said the commute was where he thought best. He was not introduced to the crew as a legend or a curiosity or the old man who had solved the problem. The expensive machine couldn't. Carl introduced him as Ezra Merritt, who has been in this industry since before most of you were alive, and he is here to teach. The crew received this with the range of responses that people in this industry have when they encounter expertise. They are not sure how to categorize some of them, skeptical in the way of people who have not yet been shown what they do not know, and some of them immediately attentive in the way of people who recognize the quality of knowledge when they are near it, even before they can name what it is. Grady Foss was in the second group. He had been there since the 20-minute walk around the mixer, since the conversation about the argument you make to the load with geometry, and he absorbed Ezra's teaching with the concentrated efficiency of a man who has found the source of something he has been looking for without knowing he was looking for it. By the end of the first month, Ezra was saying that Grady had the best hands he had taught in 40 years, which was a statement Grady received without visible reaction and carried Carl suspected for the rest of his working life. Callum came to the yard on Tuesdays after school when his schedule allowed, which was an arrangement that Ezra had proposed and Carl had agreed to without deliberating. Ezra taught Callum differently from how he taught the crew, not because Callum was family, but because Callum was 10 and came to the work without the habits that needed correcting in grown men who had been doing it wrong for years. He taught Callum the way you teach something to a person who has no reason yet to resist it, which is to say completely and without shortcuts, starting with physics and moving outward from there. He taught him the names of things which are not the same as the things themselves, but are the beginning of being able to think about them clearly. He taught him to look at the ground before he looked at the load, which was the principle Carl had arrived at secondhand on the far side of the mixer, and that Callum received directly as a first principle, before he had developed the habits that would make it necessary to relearn. Ezra worked with Merit Heavy Recovery until 2012, when his knees decided that the combination of concrete floors and Wisconsin winters had reached its quota. He was 88 years old. He came to the yard on his last Tuesday and did not make a ceremony of it, did not give a speech or accept the one that Carl had prepared, simply worked the morning as he had worked every Tuesday for 14 years, and then shook hands with the crew individually and drove back to Lincoln Avenue. Carl drove to Lincoln Avenue that evening and sat in the garage for 2 hours while Ezra talked about the jobs that had stayed with him, the ones that had asked questions he had not been ready for, and had required him to find the answers in real time. And Carl listened the way he had learned over 14 years to listen to Ezra, which was without the part of his mind that was already preparing the response. Ezra died in the spring of 2015. He was 91 years old. He died on a Tuesday, which Carl chose to interpret not as coincidence, but as the kind of detail that a life organized around the work tends to produce. He left the Holmes 750 to Carl in terms that were simple and complete. Keep it running, maintain it properly, use it when it is the right tool, and understand that knowing when it is the right tool is the entire point of everything. I spent 50 years trying to teach you. He did not use those exact words in the will, because wills are legal documents, and Ezra was precise about using the right instrument for each purpose. He said it to Carl directly in the kitchen of his house on Clement Street 3 weeks before the end, when they both knew they were in the time that comes after most things have been said, and what remains is the irreducible. Carl had said, "I know how to keep it running." Ezra had looked at him with the eyes of a man who is past being strategic about what he says and is operating on the simple fuel of what is true. Make sure Callum knows too. The machines are easier to teach than the thinking. The thinking is what I'm worried about. Carl had carried that sentence for 3 years by the time September of 2018 arrived. Callum Merritt was 30 years old. He had been running Merit Heavy Recovery for 5 years, having taken operational control in 2013 when Carl was 63, and had decided that the company was ready for the transition and that he was ready to make it, which was the most difficult professional decision he had made since the loan for the century in 1955, and which he had made in the same way with the certainty that was denser and quieter than ordinary confidence. Callum had grown up correctly for this. He had the technical foundation that Ezra had built in him, starting at age 10, the operational understanding that came from 15 years of working every role in the company at some point or another, and the disposition that Carl had come to understand was not inherited from either of his parents, but was something that had been transmitted through those Tuesday afternoons in the yard. The particular quality of attention that makes a man stop and look at the ground before he looks at the load. The company had 37 vehicles, state contracts in 3 states, a reputation that people in the heavy recovery industry in the upper Midwest referred to in the tone that Merit Heavy Recovery had once been referred to, and before Carl bought the Century 1955 respect, without the edge of resentment, because Callum ran the company in a way that did not require anyone to resent it. The call came on a Thursday morning in September, 9 days after a rainfall that had left the soil throughout the southeastern Wisconsin corridor saturated at a depth that the surface gave no indication of. Wisconsin State Patrol, the same corridor, the same stretch of I-94 east of Milwaukee, an overturned cement mixer, eastbound lanes, gross vehicle weight approximately 90,000 pounds, concrete load, partially set traffic backing up. Callum took the call and dispatched his best rotator, a 2017 Century M100, with a 100-ton rated capacity and a sticker price of $520,000, operated by a man named Hennessy, who had been with the company for 7 years and was the best operator Callum had. Callum drove to the scene himself because he always drove to the significant ones, and because something in the dispatch information, something in the combination of location and conditions and load, had activated a quality of attention in him that he had learned to trust. He arrived to find Hennessy standing beside the M100 with the expression of a man who has done everything correctly and is watching the results of correct actions fail to cooperate with the requirements of the situation. The outriggers were deployed on ground that looked solid and was not. The soil saturation from 9 days of post-rain drainage had created subsurface conditions that the pavement surface did not advertise, and the M100's outrigger pads, despite their dimensions, were distributing load across material that was giving at a rate that made stable boom geometry impossible. Hennessy had made 2 attempts and had aborted both before they became dangerous, which was exactly what a good operator does, and which had resulted exactly as it had resulted 20 years earlier on nearly this same patch of highway in a recovery vehicle that had done everything right and had not moved the load. Callum stood on the shoulder and looked at the overturned mixer, and then looked at the ground around the M100's outrigger pads, and then looked at the sky, which was clear and unhelpful. He called Carl. Carl was 68 years old and was sitting in the office on the second floor of the Merritt Heavy Recovery Yard in Waukesha when his phone rang, doing the kind of work that retirement had turned out to consist of, which was not the absence of work, but a different kind, less physical and more organizational. The work of having opinions about things when asked and keeping those opinions proportionate when not asked. He answered and listened to Callum's description of the situation and felt something he had not expected to feel, which was not déjà vu exactly, but the recognition that the wheel of a certain kind of story had completed a rotation. The mixer, the ground, the rotator that couldn't hold position. The concrete setting by the minute. Carl's voice was even. How long on the concrete? 90 minutes, maybe less. It's been in the drum since 6. Carl looked at his watch. You've got time. The M100 can't get stable footing. I'm thinking about calling in a second unit. Carl was quiet for a moment that Callum recognized as the quality of silence that preceded something considered rather than immediate. Garage on Lincoln Avenue. You know where the key is. Callum was quiet. Then, Dad, that truck is 71 years old. It moved the last mixer that beat our equipment. A pause. You know how to rig it. You know what to look for in the ground. You know why you roll instead of lift. Another pause, the briefest one. Ezra would want you to use it. The garage on Lincoln Avenue was 7 minutes from the I-94 on-ramp. Callum made it in 6. The bay was as it had always been the home 7.5, occupying the space it had occupied since Carl bought it in 2003, maintained on the schedule that Ezra had written out in the maintenance log, and that Carl had continued following after Ezra died because the log was specific and the specificity was a form of instruction. The truck was started on the first week of every month. The fluids were changed on the manufacturer's schedule, which for a 1947 truck was a schedule that had required some research because the manufacturer had not anticipated the truck still being in service in the 21st century. The tires had been replaced 3 times. The winch cable had been replaced twice. Everything that could wear had been tended before it wore through, which was the principle Ezra had applied to all machinery and which Carl had applied to this one with particular fidelity. Not out of sentimentality, but out of respect for the instruction he had been given. Callum found the key on the crossbeam where it had always been. He checked the fluid levels because Ezra had taught him to check before you start and always before you work, never after, because after is too late for what you find. The levels were correct. He started the engine on the 3rd crank, which was normal for a cold start, and let it idle for the 4 minutes that the temperature gauge required before he put it in gear, because a 1947 engine does not warm at the pace of modern engines and does not forgive being pushed before it is ready. He pulled out of the bay and onto Lincoln Avenue and drove the home 750 toward the interstate, and the sound it made in the morning street was exactly the sound Carl had described to him, the sawmill chain drive sound, the particular engine note of something that has been running for 71 years and has no intention of stopping on account of age. People on the sidewalk looked. A man walking a dog stopped and turned to watch the truck pass, not because he knew what it was, but because things that move with that quality of mechanical intention tend to draw the eye. When Callum pulled onto the shoulder of I-94, he became aware of 2 things simultaneously. The first was that the news cameras were already there because they were always already there for this kind of thing on this stretch of highway. And one of the camera operators had trained the lens on the Holmes 7.5. Oh, from the moment it appeared on the shoulder with the instinct of someone who recognizes that an old truck on a modern highway in the middle of a recovery operation is a story before anyone has explained why. The second thing Callum became aware of was that a state trooper was walking toward him who had the face of a man somewhere in his mid-50s who was having a complicated morning. The trooper watched Callum climb down from the open cab and stood beside him, looking at the Holmes 7.5, with an expression that had started as professional assessment and was becoming something more personal. His nameplate said Decker. He had been on this corridor for 22 years, which put him here in 1996, in 1997, in 1998. Is that the truck from 1998? Callum looked at him. Yes, sir. Decker looked at the truck for another moment. I was here for that recovery, directing traffic on the south end. I remember the old man who drove it. He said this with the simplicity of a man reporting a fact that has stayed accurate for 2 decades. He knew what he was doing. Callum set his hand on the Holmes 750's front fender. He did. You his grandson. Great-nephew. My father is his nephew. A pause. He passed in 2015. Decker nodded the nod of someone receiving information they had half expected. He taught you starting when I was 10. Tuesdays mostly. Decker looked at the mixer at the M100 with its problematic outrigger geometry at the Holmes 750 with its wooden boom and its olive and bone paint. What are you going to do? Callum looked at the ground. He pressed the toe of his boot against the pavement and felt the faint give that the saturation had created the same give that had defeated the M100's calculations. He looked at the mixer's angle of rest, the frame rail's contact point, the drum collar's relationship to the road surface. He looked at the sky and checked the sun angle for shadow direction, because shadow direction tells you about slope in ways that the ground surface sometimes conceals. He did all of this without hurry, because hurry was what you introduced when you had stopped thinking and needed movement to feel like progress. Ezra had told him that at 13, and he had not fully understood it until he was 26, watching a cable fail on a recovery that had been rushed and had understood it completely and permanently at that moment. Same thing my great-uncle did, Callum said. Roll it, don't lift it. Work with the ground, not against it. He went to the toolbox. Everything was where it had always been. The chains were on the left side, the cable coils behind them, the snatch blocks in the wooden compartment with the fitted dividers that Ezra had built himself to keep them from moving during transit. The wooden chocks were in the rear compartment. The steel stakes and the hand maul were in the right side compartment in the bracket that Ezra had fabricated for them, which held them at the angle that made them easy to retrieve without looking. Callum had not opened this toolbox in 8 months since the last time he had done a maintenance check on the truck, and it was exactly as he had left it, which was exactly as Ezra had kept it for 50 years. He began rigging. The ground anchor stakes went in on the shoulder soil off the pavement at the angles that the geometry required, which were not the angles that an observer would have predicted, and were not the angles that Callum had to think hard about, because they were the angles that physics required. And he knew physics the way Ezra had taught him to know it, as a language rather than a set of rules, so that you could speak it in real time rather than look it up. He ran the cable from the winch drum to the first snatch block, back to the second forward, to the mixer's underframe at the contact point between the drum collar and the road. He ran the locking chains from the drum itself to the opposing anchors. He checked every connection twice, not as a ceremony, but as the second look that is for the thing you missed the first time. Hennessy had come to stand near him while he rigged, watching with the careful attention of a man who is learning something and knows he is learning something and is not going to interrupt the learning by talking. Callum did not narrate what he was doing. The rigging explained itself to anyone who understood the physics, and for anyone who didn't, narration would not substitute for understanding. The Holmes 750's engine held at its working idle when Callum engaged the power takeoff. The winch drum turned. The cable loaded through the snatch blocks. The ground stakes held in the saturated soil the steel angle carrying the load vector at the bearing face rather than the tip, which was why Ezra had specified the angle and why Callum had matched it. The cable went taut. The mixer did not move for 20 seconds. Then it moved. It moved the same way it had moved in 1998, incrementally without drama, the rotation beginning so gradually that you had to watch the reference points to confirm it was happening. A chalk mark Callum had made on the drum collar against the road surface shifting by degrees that were small and then less small. The M100's hydraulic pump had screamed against the load and failed. The Holmes 750's winch drum turned at the same rate it had been turning for 71 years and said nothing about it. 2 feet, 4 feet. At 6 feet, the balance dynamics shifted the load vector, crossing the axis, and Callum felt it through the controls the way Ezra had described feeling it, as a quality change in the resistance rather than a reduction. The load moving from actively opposing the rotation to participating in it, and he backed off the power incrementally because the physics did not need his help anymore, and adding input would only introduce the instability that the geometry had been designed to prevent. The mixer came upright. The sound it made was the same sound it had made in 1998 metal, finding its geometry chassis loading onto suspension, a weight settling into its proper orientation after hours of being wrong. The drum was vertical. The wheels were on the pavement. The concrete inside, whatever its condition was, the drum's problem now. The silence on the highway lasted 3 seconds. Then the troopers started their noise, and Hennessy made a sound that was not quite a word. And the news camera operator who had been tracking the recovery for the past 40 minutes had the expression of a person who has been present for something they will describe accurately for the rest of their lives and who are already aware that this is happening. Decker walked over. He stood beside Callum, looking at the upright mixer. Same truck, same technique, different generation. He said it not as a question, but as a man talking through what he was witnessing in order to fully believe it. Callum looked at the Holmes 7.5. Oh, its cable still taut, its engine settling back toward idle as he disengaged the winch. Same truck, he said, same technique. He thought about what to say next and chose the thing that was most true. The same thinking, that's what got transferred. The thinking is harder to keep than the truck. He began releasing the ground anchor chains. Decker watched him for a moment and then moved off to coordinate the lane reopening because the lane needed reopening, and that was Decker's job. And because he understood that the man with the old truck did not need an audience for the work that came after the dramatic part. Callum finished releasing the rigging and began coiling the cable, which was the part of the job that nobody filmed, and everybody who did this work long enough understood was as important as the part that preceded it. Equipment returned to its proper condition after use is equipment ready for next use. Ezra had said this so many times that Callum had stopped hearing it as a statement and started hearing it as a principle, which is when teaching becomes permanent. He found the notebook on the passenger seat when he climbed back into the cab to stow the last of the chain. It was on the bench seat beside the hand crank that he had not needed today, the engine having started cleanly on the third crank, and it was a composition notebook. The black and white marbled kind, worn at the corners and soft-covered from use, and Callum recognized Ezra's handwriting on the cover in the blue ballpoint that Ezra had always used, which made vertical strokes with more weight than horizontal ones, because of the angle at which Ezra held a pen. The cover said, "For Callum Merritt, when he is ready." Callum sat in the open cab of the Holmes 750 on the shoulder of Interstate 94 and opened the notebook. The first page was dated 2010. He would have been 22. Ezra had been 86, still working Tuesdays and Thursdays, still driving himself to the yard. The handwriting was the same handwriting that had been on the maintenance log and on the Christmas cards and on the note that Ezra had left on the door of the bay one Tuesday when he had arrived before Callum started Without You Catch Up. The handwriting of a man who had written things down all his life because he understood that memory is fallible and paper is not. The notebook contained everything. Not everything Ezra knew, because what Ezra knew was not the kind of thing that fits in a composition notebook, but everything that Ezra had determined Callum needed to have in a form he could return to, which was the same thing approached from the direction of what was necessary rather than what was possible. There were rigging diagrams hand-drawn with dimensions and angles annotated in the blue ballpoint, and the diagrams had the precision of a man who understood geometry and could render it accurately without instruments. There were notes on specific soil types and what each type would and would not hold under different load configurations. There were notes on mixer recoveries, 3 of them with sketches of each rig, and the approach used and what had worked and what had needed adjustment. There was a page on the Home 7.5, specifically on its mechanical character, its tolerances, its particular responses to load. The things that a technical manual would not tell you because they could only be learned by running the machine for years and paying attention to what it said. The last page was dated March 2014. Ezra would have been 89. The handwriting was the same, but the pressure was lighter. The horizontal strokes thinner, the characteristic of an old man's hand that has not lost its precision, but is working with a different instrument than it had at 40. It said, for Callum, because Carl will forget to teach you the parts that can't be measured. Not because he doesn't know them, he knows them better than he lets on. But the parts that can't be measured are the hardest to pass forward because you can't hand them to someone. You can only put them in a place where they'll find them when they're ready. You have your father's certainty and your grandfather's patience and something that belongs only to you, which is the quality of attention that I have never been able to name, but have been watching since you were 10 years old and standing on the shoulder of a highway where a mixer had just beaten everything expensive we had. Keep the truck running. Keep the thinking sharper than the truck. The machine is the easy part. It always was. Callum sat in the open cab for a while after he finished reading. The highway was moving around him, the lanes reopening, traffic beginning its long, slow return to ordinary speed, the Tuesday morning reassembling itself into something routine. The news camera had moved on. Decker was on his radio 100 yards away. Hennessy was supervising the M100's recovery onto its carrier with the careful attention of a man who has had a difficult morning and is making sure the afternoon is better. Callum called Carl. The phone rang twice. Carl answered with the speed of a man who had been waiting for it, which he had been sitting at his desk in Waukesha since Callum had told him he was going to Lincoln Avenue, doing nothing that required his full attention because his full attention was somewhere on I-94. Callum's voice was steady. It's done. Carl let a breath out. How long? 40 minutes from when I started rigging. The concrete. Drum's frozen, but the rig is upright. Toe's already here for it. Carl said nothing for a moment, which was its own kind of communication. Then, any trouble with the truck? Started on the third crank, held steady through the whole pull. Cable's good. A pause. Dad, he left a notebook in the cab. He wrote it in 2010, and he left it there for me. The silence on Carl's end had a texture to it that Callum had learned to read over 30 years. The silence of a man receiving something he had not known was coming, and is locating it correctly before he responds to it. What does it say? Callum looked down at the composition notebook in his hand, at the blue ballpoint handwriting, at the last page with its lighter pressure and its complete and careful thought. It says the machine is the easy part. It always was. Carl was quiet for what might have been 10 seconds. When he spoke, his voice had the quality of something said from the place below professional, language below the vocabulary of contracts, and equipment and operational decisions, from the place where the work had always actually lived. Ezra would be proud. Callum set the notebook on the bench seat beside him. He started the Home 750, which caught on the first try this time, the engine warm from the recovery work, and he sat for a moment with his hands on the steering wheel that Ezra had held and Carl had held, and that had the particular quality of worn surfaces, the quality of something that has been used by people who knew what they were doing for long enough that the use itself has become a kind of instruction. He drove the Home 750 back to Lincoln Avenue. He put it in the bay and shut the engine off and sat in the silence for a moment before he climbed down, and then he climbed down with the deliberate care that the running boards required, which was a care he had learned from watching Ezra do it, and that he now performed without thinking about it, the way you perform things that have become part of how you move through the world. He locked the bay. He put the key back on the crossbeam where it had always been. The Home 750 was 71 years old. It had been built in 1947 by people who had not imagined the century it would work through, and it had been bought in 1953 by a man who had not imagined he would still be teaching it to someone 60 years later, and it had been passed from that man to his nephew, and from that nephew to his son, and the chain of passage was not about the truck. Had never been about the truck, had always been about the knowledge that the truck made physical. The understanding that the most expensive mistake is the one you make before you start them. The question is not how much force you have, but what direction the problem wants to move. That the second look is for the thing you missed the first time because you were thinking about the next step. Some things that cannot be measured are passed forward anyway, not through documents or wills or formal instruction, through the quality of attention that one person brings to a problem in front of another person who is young enough and watchful enough to receive it before they know they need it. Through Tuesday afternoons, through the habit of checking twice, through a composition notebook on a bench seat in an open cab on the shoulder of a highway where the ordinary Tuesday morning was reassembling itself into something that would continue without drama or announcement the way most important things continue. The home 7-5 waited in its bay on Lincoln Avenue. It would be started again on the first week of next month. It would be maintained on the schedule, written in the log. It would be used when it was the right tool, which required knowing when that was, which was the entire point of everything.